And hey there, it's Tom Jordan, episode 7 of Tom Jordan Live. Nice to have you here. Today we're going to dive into what's known as cultural Marxism. Why is that, you ask? Well, because there are some who believe that the worldview of a guy named Karl Marx, the author of the Communist Manifesto, is far more prevalent in our society than many would care to admit, or maybe even care to recognize that is happening here. That's coming up in a moment with my guest from Hillsdale College. Just a reminder, I'll be reading some of your comments live here on the program in a moment as well, so feel free to comment on whatever platform on which you're viewing. Also, a reminder to subscribe to our channel. That helps us out. The program, of course, is free of charge, obviously, but that certainly helps subscribing and sharing. It keeps us up and running here, and share the program to as many as you see fit. And prior to our discussion, I want to give a quick update on some breaking news that we've been watching this morning. Israel, boy, it's breaking out in the Middle East. Israel continues its defensive efforts against Hezbollah in Lebanon, striking dozens of the group's positions in southern Lebanon. Remember, they were giving a warning to the citizens there, saying, listen, you've got these missiles and these rockets that are in your garages, in homes, that are pointed directly at us, and we need to take them out. So here's fair game, fair warning to get out of there to the citizens of Lebanon so Hezbollah can be taken out. And this comes, of course, after Hezbollah escalated its own rocket attacks deep into Israeli territory, targeting the military there. There were some civilian areas, some homes in Israel. These airstrikes, part of this broader campaign to dismantle, from Hezbollah's standpoint, Israel, and Israel's standpoint, to dismantle Hezbollah's military infrastructure so they'll be safer in their own country. It's aimed at neutralizing the rocket launchers that are there, these command posts in Lebanon, and weapons stockpiles that are strategically placed in those civilian areas. They're much like Hamas, the way they do it there. Hezbollah is. And despite the international criticism against Israel, to their credit, remains firm in its mission to protect its citizens and eliminate the threats from this Iranian-backed terrorist group, while Hezbollah attempts to exploit the chaos for its own gains. Also want to touch briefly on the Trump assassination attempt, the second one. The Department of Justice, you may have seen this, but it's astonishing what they have released now. The Department of Justice has revealed and released this letter that was written by Ryan Routh. He's the guy who attempted to assassinate Donald Trump. And the letter offers a $150,000 bounty for anyone who can complete the job that he failed to complete, which is, of course, assassinating the former president. And he says his motivation for doing this stemmed from Democratic Party and media rhetoric portraying Donald Trump as unfit for office, and he's evil, and all these claims about Donald Trump coming out from the media, via the media, from the Democratic Party. And then Ryan Routh's frustration over Trump's foreign policy decisions, particularly his decisions on Iran, which is mind-blowing. So again, the DOJ releasing this letter from Ryan Routh, the man who was arrested for trying to assassinate Donald Trump. And it just really, it outlined pretty well his motivations for why he did what he did. So the content of the letter, Routh expressed regret for failing to assassinate Donald Trump, and again offered a pretty good sum of money to anyone who would succeed where he failed, which demonstrates his commitment to violent action. Why would the DOJ release this? Routh's media influence, the way he kind of came to his decision, he specifically blamed media narratives, which we talked about last week. The media narratives that paints Donald Trump as, unfit to be anything, but also as this dictator that wants to overthrow the United States, which is totally false, and it's dangerous. He used those narratives to develop his motive for killing the former president. And I think it just shows the power of media rhetoric and how dangerous it is. And the letter directly ties Routh's violent intentions to the Democratic-led discussions that demonized Donald Trump, fueling his belief that removing Trump was a moral duty. And if you remember from the White House podium, Karine Jean-Pierre doubled down, tripled down that Donald Trump is a threat to this country. Even when Peter Doocy with Fox News said, listen, don't you think this rhetoric is dangerous? It might lead to these types of attacks on Donald Trump. He says, we're backing it up with evidence. So this is also concerning that Ralph was particularly outraged by Donald Trump's foreign policy decisions, including the severing of ties with Iran. Iran is an enemy of the United States. So Ralph blamed the destabilization of the Middle East on the fact that Donald Trump pulled back from Iran. But a lot of experts say actually the destabilizing of the Middle East has far more to do with the Biden administration allowing Iran to generate tens of billions of dollars by pulling back in their sanctions against Iran. So now they got like $80 billion worth of money to fund Hezbollah and to fund Hamas and fund the Houthis and to ramp up its own attacks and its own, political rhetoric that is spreading throughout the world regarding Israel. And they also fund, there's a lot of information coming out that Iran is directly funding a lot of these pro-Hamas demonstrations within the United States. And you think about that, what that has led to these anti-American, anti-Israel sentiments from people like Ryan Ralph. Ralph apologized in that letter to Iran for Donald Trump's presidency, and he seems to be aligned with these foreign powers over his own country. So when you see that kind of rhetoric coming out, you kind of wonder what that could potentially lead to, and it's obviously political violence, the violence that can be directly linked to the media and the political rhetoric that dehumanizes political opponents in this culture that's been created where extreme actions seem to be justified. Why is that happening? Well, I want to get into Marxism. And I had a conversation with a good friend of mine the other day. We disagree politically on a lot of issues, but we're tight. We have a good friendship, but we're honest with each other. And the discussion of being civil in our political dialogue came up. You know, stop all the name calling out there, which is unnecessarily. Like I just talked about what that leads to and all this hateful rhetoric. And that was our discussion. But then my friend said something to me. He said, like stop calling Kamala Harris a communist. And I thought about that for a second. I said, well, wait a second. Communism refers to a set of policy issues. That's not just like name calling. That's pointing out a person's view on economics or a candidate's perspective on social issues, social cohesion and equal outcomes and equity and all these things we're seeing in our society. These are policy issues. And that's when I think of somebody calling someone else a Marxist or a communist or a socialist, that deals specifically with policy issues. And there is one candidate in this current presidential race that seems to align with those Marxist ideals, those communist ideas, or at least socialist ideals, without using the word communism or socialism or Marxism. To whom am I referring? Which candidate might align with Marxism? Take a look.
Supposed so-called extreme leaders are suggesting it's a bad thing to care about and pay attention to inequities, to say DEI is a bad thing, when in fact, if we want fair outcomes, we must understand what are disparities and then accommodate and adjust for those disparities if we want equal outcomes. So environmental justice raises those points, right? Equitable outcomes. Is everyone coming out the same way? Well, if you don't start on the same base, everybody can have an equal amount. You're still not going to end up on the same base, right? If we want equal outcomes, we need to take into account not everybody starts out on the same base, and we have to make adjustments.
All right, Kamala Harris there. She says we have to make adjustments. What does that mean? What does equal outcomes mean? Well, meaning essentially that the government needs to ensure everyone makes the same wage, has the same type of house, and the government needs to step in. And for those who can't afford a down payment, for example, give them the money for a down payment on a house, like Kamala Harris wants to do, the $25,000. Same outcome regardless of what you do for a living. Everyone is the same. That's Marxism. And believe it or not, Cultural Marxism is already here, and it's tearing apart the fabric of American society. And oh, that's baloney, Tom, you might insist. Well, we are witnessing the consequences in everything from racial tensions to the radicalization of feminism, the push for transgender ideology, open borders, even fiscal recklessness. These ideologies are undermining the basic rights and the legal protections we've long valued. It's no secret that Marx's ideas led to disaster in the Soviet Union and in China. Yet today's cultural elites and these political movements continue to embrace them under this guise of equity and diversity, that this is what equal rights means. It doesn't. Dear friends of mine who left China many years ago, they say that what Mao did back then to bring, to power the Chinese Communist government and the Chinese Communist Party is exactly what he's witnessing right now in his now home country, the United States of America. Cultural Marxism isn't just this abstract academic idea, and for that matter, neither is critical race theory, which some friends of mine like to say. It's just a theory. No, it's active it's systemic in our society. It is real and it is here, and it's a threat to liberty. And it always at first disguises itself as the right thing to do for mankind. And I want to give you an example of this. Watch this video. It's a warning from Hillsdale College.
The
goals that socialists are trying to achieve are noble.
The rhetoric of socialism is attractive. It speaks of a humane ideal.
Marx, like Marxists and communists after him, were answering some pretty fundamental questions to the human condition.
Marx believed that vast inequalities of wealth would lead to inequalities of power. The secret to Marxism is he was right when considering a profane liberal society.
What human history shows is people like having their own things. Actual socialism, the denial of private property and rights, doesn't work economically and produces human misery.
Marxist socialism was the prevailing ideology in one of the most powerful countries in the world, the Soviet Union.
Stalin took very seriously the idea that socialism needs to transform human nature, and any leftovers of self-interest need to be cleansed out of human nature.
What the privileged elites were being told to do was in conformity with an ideology which was like a religion. The beneficiaries were not ordinary people.
Attempting to eliminate all evils actually means you have to commit terrible, terrible evils, and you never get to a better place either.
Anybody that was not willing to do what they needed to do to carry out their role in this new socialist economy would be dispensed with.
The journey that you're about to go on will teach you how Marxism became one of the most compelling and attractive ideologies of our time.
The central questions of this series are: what is communism? Why has it been so enduringly popular? And can it be good? Can it ever work?
Socialism is still alive and competing in the contemporary moment for power.
The dream itself, the goal itself, complete abolition of human self-interest, is completely at odds with human nature. It was a failure, and it has to be a failure, and always will be.
So yeah, Hillsdale College now has this course that they are offering. It's a new course at the conservative college called Marxism, Socialism, and Communism. And it really dives deep into Karl Marx's dangerous legacy. And it shows how today's politics and really society in America may be more permeated with some of these ideologies than we all realize. I want to talk today. We're glad to welcome from Hillsdale College, Dr. Kevin Slack. He is the Associate Professor of Politics at the Van Andel Graduate School of Statesmanship. Doctor, it's so nice to have you on the program. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Good to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
I'm so glad that Hillsdale is putting this out because a lot of us have recognized this ideology that has been permeating our country. much longer, I think, than most of us realize. I mean, you can go back to, maybe even 100 years back, and you see the foundation of some of these concepts beginning to infiltrate our government. And, I go back to maybe even beyond Woodrow Wilson, but this progressivism that was coming into our country. But can you explain to people, because I had a conversation the other day with a friend of mine, and he said he gets so angry when people use that word communist, like it's a derogatory term to call somebody that name. You're a communist, and he gets frustrated when he's liberal, and he says that when people call like Kamala Harris communist, that's just a label. I said, well, no, it's actually policy. It's a policy that aligns with these ideologies of Karl Marx. So that's kind of fair game. But for a lot of us who don't fully understand what communism is, what socialism is, and what Marxism is, can you kind of give us the foundation of what our discussion will be? What is all of that in your view?
Well, Marxism is something of a nebulous term. So initially, it's the idea that there would be a revolution that would overthrow those who own the mode of production in a society. So it focuses on economics. And I think the confusion stems from the fact that what became the primary mode of Marxism was, what we call a cultural Marxism, and that's where the primary oppression isn't economic. There's this almost not a disavowal, but we don't focus on class as much, and we talk about the more primordial modes of oppression, which would be race primarily or gender. So communism itself was a utopian promise of Marx, right? The end game of communism would be, in the words of Marx, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. That's largely been laid aside, I think, by the radicals in America today. And so, the friend you were talking to would say, we don't hold to that kind of a communist consciousness as an end game. However, what Marx did promise, and I think that still remains, is this utopian end, whether it has to do with race or gender or any of those other things. And I think what the right is doing right today is they're resurrecting that word communism to trace the radicalism that was born from Marx back to its roots, and to say, okay, well, this is a heritage that you have to own and address.
I think that's great, and I really want to dive into the cultural Marxism aspect of this. But are there some, I guess, is there a tidbit of the economic positions of Karl Marx that we're seeing? Because we've seen Kamala Harris come out very vocally and proudly claim some of these economic principles. I mean, she was speaking, and I played a clip earlier of her saying, basically, we've got to have, equity. They have to have equal outcomes. And a lot of people are not born into wealth. So essentially what she seems to be advocating is for the generational wealth. If Kamala Harris says something like, we need to basically take the money from those who have so much of it and allow it to be given to those who weren't born in such positions. So the outcomes economically are the same, that there's equality or there's equity in the outcomes, regardless of what it is you do for a living or regardless of what your parents did for a living. Is that touching more on those Marxist economic principles?
Yeah, I think so. And I also think that that's where it connects to this cultural element, which would be we're going to redistribute based upon these differences of race or of gender. It's also very noteworthy that Marx himself, when he talked about this communist consciousness that was the end of this historical dialectic, that it wouldn't happen instantly. So you have this, what he called the withering away period of the state. And what that required was administrative rule and the end of politics, because for Marx, all political relations were oppressive. How does it tie into today? Well, nobody I have met recently thinks the Democratic Party is the party of the working man, the way that it claimed to be. Everyone knows that the largest corporate sponsors are for the Democratic Party. And we've had recent news reports about the DNC in Chicago relating that fact. So Kamala Harris can talk about economic inequality, but what she's really talking about is redistributing wealth from the middle class, from the old working class based upon race or gender, if you're white, for example, and redistributing that to different constituencies. And I think the Democratic Party has been very successful on that score, and that is promising goodies to those who vote for them, whether they're illegal or legal.
Right. That's a big part of it. The subsidy-driven economy or the, giving to those. Like, I don't know, so I'll bring up Kamala Harris again because she's now saying that we want to give, a $25,000 subsidy for people who can't afford to put down a down payment on a home. So the government is going to step in and do that for those people in certain classes. And I look at that and I say, well, that doesn't speak to me of either free markets. It doesn't speak to me of equality. Some people get money, some people don't, based on what their current, I guess, you can put this in quotes, need is. But the whole idea is that we're separating. They use this word equity and equality a lot, but then you see these groups and they're labeled as such, whether it's like radical feminism or, what they call now anti-racist ideologies. What they're really doing to me, and when I look at this, is further dividing the country and the people based on these immutable traits that nobody can do anything about. And because you're born with that immutable trait, you are necessarily then, you have this characteristic. And because of that characteristic, we're either going to thrust you aside, put you on the back burner, or we're going to advance you to the front of the line. Is that kind of what cultural Marxism is? Is that an aspect, a tentacle of it?
Sure. I also think there's the element. So we talk about cultural Marxism, its roots really go back, one could argue, to the 1920s. But in the United States, what you found was radicals in the late 60s, Stokely Carmichael, who was affiliated with Black Power, or you could even get to the Weather Underground, the Rat Billy Ayers, Bernardine Dorn, and so on. And they're actually citing Lenin or Frantz Fanon and these other Marxists. And so they're importing a much more radical variant that they think can be applied to the United States. What's interesting to me is these were all upper middle class kids, whether you're talking about Stokely Carmichael or any of these radicals in SDS. And I think that what has been pointed out, and what's very useful to point out, is that the upper middle class likes Marxism and the divisiveness you're talking about because it gives them something to crusade for. This is very much a religious movement. I have not seen the recent documentary by Matt Walsh, but apparently he goes and he sits in these racial sensitivity training courses. And it's these whites who feel this need to confess because the old modes of religion aren't there anymore, and this provides a substitute for them. So I think the divisiveness you're talking about, that we would say is very problematic, that's encouraged, and then it gives these highly educated and often very intelligent young people something to give their lives to, right? To fight against racism, to be an ally against racism, to confess their white privilege, and so on.
Yeah, and it seems to have seeped into all aspects of society. I mean, it's within our government, obviously, because we all remember Nancy Pelosi and members of the House getting on one knee and bowing down, in a sense, to African Americans because of their white guilt that they want to, I guess, convey and somehow make an atonement for, and encourage other white people in this country to do the same thing, to kneel down. But we've seen it in churches. I mean, I've seen pastors who have said, listen, let's put down the Bible, and we need to put that aside, and let's bring up books like White Fragility, this book that explains that white people are guilty. And this is like a white audience. I remember this one pastor was preaching to, saying, all of you in here are guilty of racism and your privilege, and you need to get over it, and you need to stop it and admit it. And I thought, this is happening in the church as well. So it just shows how deep within this country this ideology is. And it's like you talked about the end game here. What is the end game? And I don't know if there's ever been an example of this type of Marxism or any type of Marxism actually being effective and successful in doing what they claim it's going to do, which is to set people free and make them equal with everybody. And you look back to the Soviet Union, you can look at, Cuba, and so you can look at China and Mao and what's happened in those countries as well. Has this ever worked in your view?
Well, if you take the old Marxism, certainly was a failure. I think that the new promises are a bit different. So on the one hand, you have promises that we will eventually reach a post-racial society once we divide our society along the lines of race so that we can openly redistribute, we can confess privileges or oppressions, and so on the one hand. On the other hand, a very disturbing aspect of the application of these radical ideas is that particularly young Americans are going to live in a society where they don't own anything, right? This is a society with a democratic party that's very friendly to big tech and to internet censorship. And so everyone, the audience is probably familiar with the World Economic Forum essay.
Hmm.
It's 2030. I don't own anything, and I've never been happier. Well, in conservative circles, the question is never one of state ownership. It's one of whose ownership, right? Who doesn't own anything? And so they're making these young Americans oddly comfortable with the idea that they're not going to own anything. But none of the people who lead these movements are actually without anything. You mentioned Robin DiAngelo, incredibly wealthy. Ta-Nehisi Coates, the people who play to this division, make lots and lots of money doing it. I often think of it as a return to the simony of the medieval period where because you have a special knowledge in the mystical rights of equity, now you're going to be hired by the state to teach these things. So the supposed end game is that we'll eventually get to a place where we see beyond race or beyond gender altogether. But in the meantime, in this withering away period of the state and oppression, we're going to see heightened forms of it.
Well, okay, so you mentioned the World Economic Forum, and you're right. That is something they have been touting, and it seems to be, the equitable thing to do is to give up property rights, which I mentioned Woodrow Wilson before, and he was seemingly opposed to individual property rights because I think in his view it made the government that much less efficient to get things done. When you got property owners out there who are citizens, they can stand up for their own rights, and it makes more of a slow process when you have these three branches of government and getting stuff done. He didn't seem to like that, which is surprising that it was happening that long ago. But the World Economic Forum, now that they're touting this idea people not owning anything. Can you touch on why property rights and property ownership is so important and how that ties to individual liberties and individual freedoms here in the United States?
I think it's because it's part of the tradition of natural rights, right? That we believe that there are certain rights that you have as under, what the founders called natural law. And that meant that you had certain freedoms, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, and that one of those primary forms of right was property right. And this was inseparable from your status as a Republican citizen. I think with the World Economic Forum, what's behind it is the idea that, in this new kind of stakeholder capitalism, what we're going to have is management of the world's resources and redistribution for a truly just planet. And the thing that stands in the way of that most of all are the old national identities, the ideas of the old religions, and the idea that there are certain rights that can't be trampled upon. And so if you look at education in the United States, these things have been zeroed out as being the problem going back to the late 60s. And I think that's why it's such a concern for anybody who has this dream of planetary justice. I'll also point out that because of the backlash, so Klaus Schwab, who was the president, actually stepped down. He's still on the board of the World Economic Forum. But or another thing is corporations, universities have begun to drop the DEI statements because there has been, thankfully, a backlash against these policies. I think that there's more work to be done on the conservative side. If you look at the projections for DEI as a global market, it's basically doubled since 2020. I think it was 7.5 billion in 2020, and it's projected to be 15.4 billion by 2024, according to some of the estimates that I've read. So you may not have the same propaganda, but the question is, are the positions still the same? Do you still have those offices of power? Can you still make decisions in the American bureaucracy without the consent of the people's representatives? That's how a lot of this was rammed down the Americans' throats in education and otherwise, is through the EEOC or through Title VI from the '64 Civil Rights Act, where radicals took over the boards that would implement these policies, and they implemented very radical policies. Title IX is another good example, where these are now far afield from the original intentions of those bills, and they've implemented radical programs. So you'd have to really change that, and I think that's why Trump is such a concern for those on the left, is that he's promising to do it. And we'll see if he wins, if he's successful or not, and if he carries through on that.
Is that the real threat, do you think, when they say Donald Trump is a threat to democracy? What do they really mean by that? That he's a threat to their ultimate goal here is to infiltrate this country completely with what they don't want to call DEI anymore, but this cultural Marxism, and make us more connected to the entire global network of Marxists? Is that what his real threat is?
Well, I don't know if I'd say global network of Marxists, but I think what in the United States that there is a power structure that's in existence that elections really don't determine the interpretation of laws, that we have an administrative state where unelected bureaucrats make those decisions. And Donald Trump is the first president or someone running for president who's promised to overthrow that. And no other Republican has actually promised to do that. If you go back to George W. Bush or any of the other candidates, McCain, right, Mitt Romney, they were pretty much happy with the status quo. I wish Mitt Romney had vented just a little of the ire he had for Donald Trump against Barack Obama when he ran for president. What you see is the Bushes, the Cheneys, they're all endorsing Kamala Harris for president. So there's something Trump is doing that I think really upsets not just those on the left, but I would say those who hold power in Washington, D.C. And that's because whether he follows through it or not, he's threatening real political change. And that's a change that we haven't seen going back to the creation of the administrative state.
Yeah, and I would like to see that change as well. And I think you're right about that. There are some, Republicans. It's just surprising to me that a Dick Cheney and the Bushes would support a Kamala Harris who is so antithetical, we thought, to what their policy positions were while they were in power. Like when George W. Bush was in the White House, we thought that he would be completely opposed to those types of policies, but this hatred of a guy who represents something far different than maybe what they truly want deep down, which is power. They're now projecting, it seems to be, on him. What apparently what they're claiming, what they really want, is that kind of hold on power and projecting that on a Donald Trump. You mentioned something that you said that the phrase "the old religions." And Karl Marx, did not like religion. I think he categorized religion, faith is the opium of the people, or is that what he said? Yeah, the opium of the people. And there was this idea that atheism in Marxism or atheism in communism, whether it's cultural or not, need to start at the same place. That there is no God, there is no higher authority. That is, that we're endowed by these various rights by our Creator. They don't necessarily believe that. And so, in that kind of a mindset or worldview, who then, in a cultural Marxist world or worldview, has the highest authority, and who must we as individual citizens submit to?
In Marx's assessment, it would be science. And his own science of economics would reveal to us what we are as human beings, our true species nature. So there'd be a moment of revelation that would be a substitute, but a true one, that would help us to understand what we are as humans, and that would be communist in our natures. He's beginning from a bit different place. He's saying, look, capitalism has already destroyed these things that you're concerned about being destroyed. He would say capitalism has destroyed the family. It's broken us apart in what he called the icy waters of cold calculation. And I think the challenge for us today is that when we talk about, say, even conservatism, if it's nothing more than an economic conservatism that talks about growing the economy or wealth, and it's shorn from these other questions of meaning and final purpose, whether it's religion or whether it's natural rights republicanism, the things that made America what it is. Marx is offering a substitute, and if we don't provide one, just as an American people, if all we have is a profane teaching of American history, then something will step in the void. And I think that's the potency and the power of Marxism, cultural Marxism, what you will, is that it's promising perfect justice on this planet, something that all the great philosophers, religious thinkers have said is an impossibility, but it's very effective. And there has to be something that provides that sense of meaning and purpose. And I think that the left has done that very successfully.
So when you hear Republicans come out and say, "Yeah, I'm a conservative, I'm an economic conservative, but I don't want to engage at all in these culture wars that are occurring in this country," what does that say to you?
I Most of the time so I'll read the Wall Street Journal from time to time, and when they talk about an economic conservatism, I'm honestly not even sure what they mean. I think I know, but for them, what it means is open borders. It means support for very large corporations, right? Even when they're suppressing freedom of speech. And so all the things that have disrupted American society and the rights and the privileges that we have, Those are the things that they claim to be conservative. And I think this is why Trump is such a disruption. On those three issues of trade, immigration, and war, Trump was able to point out disastrous policies that followed the 1990s, the major outsourcing under the Bush administration. And I think that those are very lucrative, and that there's a lot of wealthy Americans tied to the Wall Street Journal. Remember, the Wall Street Journal is that's the journal that has openly advocated open borders at various times in its own history. And so that kind of a conservatism can benefit a certain class of Americans, but on the other hand, it's hurt many Americans. So I think it's a false understanding of what conservatism is that comes out of the 1960s and that did many good things on those issues, for economic issues, trying to eat into the liberal policies of state planning and state management of the 1960s. But on the other hand, if you take that too far, for the example, in open competition, you extend that to just open borders, or you extend it to outsourcing some of the key weapons systems in defense, that you end up hurting the entire American Republic. So I think those conservatives had something very unique to offer, very good to offer all throughout the 80s and the 90s. And I would still say that. But I think that many of their policies went too far. For example, the Soviet Union. Nobody's going to argue the Soviet Union was a good regime, but has the constant war that we've been involved in for the last 20 years, has that been good, not just for Americans, it's been good for many of the countries that we've occupied, invaded, and so on. So I think that the old conservatism did good things, but now Trump is representing a form of conservatism that's questioning that and saying, okay, how is it we can bring some common sense back to those policies, particularly on trade, immigration, and war?
Hmm. One final question, and I want to just briefly touch on the course itself. But you have professors there at Hillsdale, including yourself, and one of them said that like Marxism claims they want to eliminate all evils in society, and he says that this Hillsdale professor that trying to eliminate all evils requires committing terrible evils. Like the ends justify the means, and I've seen that occurring in this country more and more over the past several years. And I've got friends who fled China, and they fled the communism and the cultural communism, all these Marxism that we're seeing here in this country. And they're saying, Tom, this is exactly how Mao came to power. What we're seeing in the United States now is what people were starting to flee from early on, prior to Mao gaining power in their former country. Is that part of it? I mean, do you see the same thing happening in the United States?
I mean, I think that this temptation to vast forms of power is always going to be with human nature, and oddly enough, that much of the cruelty seems to vindicate the cause that they're promoting.
Right.
It seems to be an evidence to them that they're winning, that they're succeeding because of the chaos and the obstacles that it creates. So you have this idea that it's a noble romantic sacrifice. You find this among upper middle class whites. They'll talk about my people is the enemy, right? And so for them, it's a romantic crusade, and what they mean is mom and dad back at home. But they have this idea that they are engaged in the ultimate sacrifice, which means they're better than you, that they are more virtuous than you are, because they're the ones who are on the front lines in the fight against racism. So I think that temptation exists with all of us, this idea of moral superiority.
Yeah. And that goes back to why the founders put in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, is because we all have the capability, each individual, to be either good or evil within each individual. And rather than separating people by different, oppressive type of classes, we all have that within us. And that's why we have the laws that we do to protect each individual citizen in this country from what everyone has the temptation to do, which is to not only hold on to power, but to gain more power, which takes away the rights of individual citizens. The class is at Hillsdale College. It's online, and it deals with Marxism, socialism, and communism, diving deep into these ideologies from Karl Marx. How can people become a part of this? I understand these are accessible just to the general public.
Yeah, if you just pull searches for it, Hillsdale online classes, then you'll find a bunch of links to it. So it's free to sign up for and free to watch.
Yeah. It's amazing. I've taken some of those courses online in years past, and they're phenomenal. And people who just want an education, a great, civics education, it's a wonderful thing to be a part of. And so this is a very important course. And when people say, Marxism, communism, or cultural Marxism, that's not existing. That's just kind of a conspiracy theory. No, I think it does exist quite well. And nobody tells the story better, in my view, than Hillsdale College. Dr. Kevin Slack, Van Andel Graduate School of Statesmanship, Associate Professor of Politics. Dr. Slack, it's so good to have you. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
What human history shows is people like having their own things. Actual socialism, the denial of private property and rights, doesn't work economically and produces human misery.
Marxist socialism was the prevailing ideology in one of the most powerful countries in the world, the Soviet Union.
Stalin took very seriously the idea that socialism needs to transform human nature, and any leftovers of self-interest need to be cleansed out of human nature.
Yeah, self-interest needs to be cleansed out of human nature. That's socialism, that's Marxism, that's communism. I want to thank Dr. Slack from Hillsdale College for joining me to talk about it. And he also, he suggests that this whole idea, this identity politics, has really led the American left to pursue policies that promote division rather than unity. And this shift has polarized, political and social discourse, turning every issue into a matter of identity rather than policy or principle. And I think it stifles meaningful debate as people are encouraged now to view disagreements through the lens of oppression rather than a reasoned argument, making it nearly impossible to find, I think, common ground or solutions of these shared challenges that exist. And another thing about Marxists, the way that they view religion, Karl Marx, he viewed religion as his tool of oppression. He famously described it, as I mentioned in this interview, religion as the opium of the people, like a comforting illusion used to pacify the masses and justify their exploitation. So you can see why there's this push and this bent against certain religions in this country. And Karl Marx believed that religion served to maintain the status quo of the elites by encouraging the working class to accept suffering and inequality in the hope of reward in an afterlife, thereby, hindering the revolutionary consciousness. This is Karl Marx's thinking regarding it. And atheism was really central to Karl Marx's philosophy. Like, do not believe in God, as he argued, that true liberation could only be achieved by freeing people from religion and these illusions that he believed perpetuated social and economic oppression. And you can go back to how his ideas played out in these various communist countries, and the exact opposite had occurred. He had a materialistic worldview that really rejected the existence of any kind of supernatural realm, that it didn't exist. And he did see religion as this mere human construct that reflected societal conditions rather than any type of divine truth. So in Marxist thought, atheism was not just a rejection of personal belief, but it was a political imperative. You had to be atheist in order to achieve the political goals of the communists. Religion was seen as kind of reinforcing the hierarchical structures that oppressed the working class. And for Marx, the critique of religion was linked from its very core to the critique of capitalistic societies, where religious institutions were kind of free, right? They were viewed as part of the ideological superstructure, as he calls it, that sustained what he called economic exploitation. But I think a lot of capitalists would say, no, these are economic opportunities. And that bears out if you study history in capitalist societies versus socialist societies and communist societies. So he was a big supporter of the abolition of religion. He thought it was necessary for people to achieve, class consciousness, religious belief distracted from the real world conditions of economic inequality and class struggle and all these things. So atheism it was important in Marxist countries, and it ended up becoming mandated. Like Marxist communism says that the end of religious beliefs is essential for the creation of a truly egalitarian society where, social relations are based on material realities rather than what they would call superstition or spiritual. So atheism was often mandated in these countries, the Soviet Union. There was people that would want to talk about Christianity. I mean, look at China. There's one of the fastest growing churches in the world right now is in China, but it's underground because people are realizing that what Jesus taught, Jesus viewed himself much differently, obviously, than what Karl Marx would view Jesus. Without him, there is no proper view of individual liberty, is what Christians believe. And if you take God out of the equation, you also take with it the idea of loving God and, by extension, sharing God's love for all of mankind. Christianity is essential, a lot of people believe, for a free and loving society because it provides the moral foundation that you can say and you can argue that upholds, human dignity, individual rights, personal responsibility, taking responsibility for your own mistakes and failures and learning from those things. So at its core, Christianity, Jesus, what he taught, this inherent value of each individual who was created in the image of God. That's what the Bible talks about, which forms the whole basis for recognizing universal human rights. A belief in Christianity or a religion, it compels people to treat others with love and compassion and respect, laying the groundwork for a society that values liberty and justice for all. So a free society thrives on personal responsibility. And I've read atheists who have said the same thing. Atheists say, listen, I don't believe in God. This is an atheist saying, but I do believe that Christianity is good for society. So in a sense, they become more cultural Christians without their belief in Jesus as being the only true way, the way to life, eternal life, which is critical for an individual, but they still see the benefits that Christianity provides to society. And if you don't have a transcendent kind of moral authority over the government, everything devolves into this kind of regulatory, mandated society where everybody has to be the same. And if you step out of line, things will not be good for you because the individual does not matter in that kind of a Marxist society. So self-sacrificial love, which is necessary for really a harmonious society, that's what Christianity teaches. This framework for resolving conflicts and healing divisions. It doesn't lead to chaos. It does the opposite, where love governs human interactions. So this is the difference at its core between Marxism, an oppressive society, and religion and a free society. So anyway, Hillsdale College has these great programs, and I've gone on there before and taken some of the courses. If you want to kind of brush up on your civics, so whether or not you can go online, they have a whole slew of different types of courses you can take for free. It's online and it's free. It's a service of Hillsdale College. Some update on news. You might have heard from the Biden and Kamala Harris administration that manufacturing jobs are up. Well, in fact, the opposite is true. The manufacturing sector has experienced a very sharp, what they call a contraction. It has fallen, manufacturing, to a 15-month low in September. This month, it is down. So the U.S. manufacturing sector's decline is reflected in this report. It's the Purchasing Managers Index. It says in September. That points to a real significant contraction in the economy and activity and worsening business conditions within the manufacturing sector. And it's already been struggling with the weakening demands that we've been seeing and reduced domestic sales and falling orders overseas for these exports as well. So it's not just a fluke. It's something that is happening. It's a reflection, I think, of deeper economic policies that have really undermined the industrial stability in this country. And when manufacturing suffers, it affects the very foundation of middle-class jobs. If you have over-reliance on foreign markets and these regulations in the United States, in the factories. It makes it less competitive. So Kamala Harris is on the campaign trail, as you know. So is Donald Trump. And today, Donald Trump is going to talk more about some of his economic policies that he says is going to benefit manufacturing. Kamala Harris is going to come out, I believe, tomorrow to give some of her economic policy details. I don't know how many details will be involved, but they both say they're fighting for the middle class. And you got to wonder if that's true, because if Kamala Harris, so let's look at the corporate tax for one. So Donald Trump wants to keep the corporate tax at 15%. Kamala Harris wants to raise it to about 30%. And she says that helps the middle class. And you got to ask, why would that help the middle class? If corporations are paying more in taxes, they will necessarily move overseas to other countries where they don't tax their companies as much. Think about that. The government comes in and says, we like that you've made your $2 billion this year. We're going to take 30% of all of that, and we get to do with it what we would like. And that's not fair, and that trickles down, absolutely does, to workers. And you look at this mismanagement, I think, in the government, how it's hitting these blue-collar workers the very hardest. So if you don't have these solid policies to support manufacturing sector, and solid, good policies means also deregulation and lifting the tax burden on these companies and, by extension, the individuals. Otherwise, all these more and more people are going to be left behind. And it's alarming to a lot of people how far we have strayed from those foundational principles of, the free markets and whatnot. We're all watching the Federal Reserve as well. We know they're cutting interest rates, and the labor market seems to be cracking through all of this. So there is some concern about the pace of the economic deterioration. Is it deteriorating faster than most economists would like to see? Is there any robust nature in this? We'll keep talking about economics as the days go on here on Tom Jordan Live, as we're getting, of course, 6 weeks away from the election. All right, I promised I would get to some comments here, and I'd love to hear from you. Of course, if you might still have a moment to comment if you would like. It's any of our platforms, Tom Jordan Live, whether it's on YouTube, on Facebook, on X, and we're on all the major social media and podcast platforms as well. So Cameron and Caleb are back there monitoring the comments. What do we have back there? If you want to bring it up on the screen. Can you bring that up? All right. All right. Hey, Tom, can you define rhetoric? What exactly do you mean by rhetoric from the left or from the right? Okay, Caleb, that's a very good question. So when I talk about rhetoric, what I typically mean by that is some form of manipulation. We talk about rhetoric or the phrase political rhetoric. So an attempt very artfully and skillfully to do so, to manipulate with a sense of insincerity. Like you're not exactly telling the truth. It's using words, whether it's the written word or it's, you're given an interview on NBC News and you're a politician, you're most likely engaging in some form of rhetoric, trying to convince somebody of something you want them to believe without necessarily presenting the facts of that. That's rhetoric. It's insincere. It's an attempt to manipulate and very artfully done. I mean, there are classes on political rhetoric and how to give speeches that will convince people to do something they currently do not want to do. You might see that a lot in sales and advertising and marketing and all these things, but it's very prevalent, of course, in politics, because what people are trying to do who are running for office is to convince you that they're great and the other person is the opposite of great, is like evil. So to do that, you need to use and engage in rhetoric, manipulation. So for example, there's a lot of examples out there today, but you can look at one of these ads that are playing on your radio or television stations where Kamala Harris continues to make the claim that Donald Trump wants to destroy this country. He wants it to be all about him. He wants to be a dictator on day one. That would be rhetoric. That's not true. It's not backed up by the facts. It's backed up by taking phrases out of context and cutting out sentences and dissecting them in thirds in order to take a comment that doesn't match what he was truly saying. But if you take it by itself, it's out of context. So when she says things like, Donald Trump's playbook is Project 2025, that is false. It's demonstrably false. Donald Trump not only has said it himself, but the authors of Project 2025 have also said that Donald Trump had nothing to do with this. This is our, this is the Heritage Foundation that wrote this prior to Donald Trump even, running for office. It was their idea of what they believe would be beneficial for whoever takes the presidency in 2025. And if it was a conservative president, here are some of the ideas that they had that they would like to move forward. And it's very interesting that you bring this up, because this was the genesis of Project 2025, according to the Heritage Foundation, was that it was a battle against cultural Marxism, which happens to be what we were discussing this morning. Division in this country and the rise to power of the administrative state and the centralizing of government. That's Marxism. What Donald Trump wants to do, which is the same in this regard, what Project 2025 was aiming to do, was to decentralize the government and return many of the policy decisions back to either local control or put them back into the hands of the elected leaders, like Congress. Members of the House of Representatives should be the ones who are creating laws. But too often now, they're writing vague laws and turning them over to some bureaucratic agency, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency or something else, the Food and Drug Administration, one of those, three-letter agencies, the bureaucrats, and giving them the authority to create laws that directly affect you from a centralized federal location. That's what Project 2025 has aimed to do. So not only is it not Donald Trump's platform, it's also doing the opposite of what right now Kamala Harris and Democrats claim it's doing. It's taking away the power from the centralized federal government and returning it to the elected leaders in office, the responsibility there, and bringing it back to the states and to the local governments. So that is essentially, because we now think, many Americans do, that Project 2025 is evil. That's because of political rhetoric, an attempt to manipulate the masses. A long answer to a short question, but I hope that helps you understand. What I mean by rhetoric is that artful and skillful attempt to manipulate masses of people. All right, any other... The engineer, I always like the engineer. Very good guest. Yeah, thank you, the engineer. He was. I like Dr. Slack with Hillsdale College, and we'll keep in touch with Hillsdale because they provide a lot of good content out there. They're a conservative college. And when I was first turned on to Hillsdale, I lived in a different state. I didn't know there were a college in Michigan, the southern portion of the state, but they're widely hailed and recognized as an organization that is all about civil liberties, and they are conservative in their approach to the Constitution and what the founding fathers really meant when they wrote that historic document that kind of frames the way our government should be treating its citizens. And so it's a conservative view of those types of things. And I found it fascinating that they're, if not one of the very first colleges in the country to, I forgot exactly how that happened. One of the first, Black African-American college students went to Hillsdale College because they weren't all about judging people based on the color of their skin. They were based on, meritocracy. If you're doing well, you should be rewarded for your good works and then advance you to the next level. So it really, I think, ignited this feel for individuals to pursue greatness and to excel in their own personal lives, and they'll be rewarded for that regardless of the color of your skin. And that's the conservative viewpoint, and I think that's why the Republican Party was founded way back when, just right before the Civil War. All right, that's it for this edition, episode 7 of Tom Jordan Live. Remember, go to tomjordanlive.com. We'd love for you to subscribe. You can get on our email list. I'll be updating you on the latest things happening here. If you become a Patreon subscriber, that will give you access to a whole slew of things we're planning in the works, but exclusive content that we'll be developing and some private one-on-one conversations with me or group chats that we're going to have. A lot of things, and it's very inexpensive. It's like $2.50 a month. $2.50 or maybe $5 gets you to that higher tier. That's all it takes. But it does help us continue to program the content that you're seeing right here today, for an example, on Tom Jordan Live. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. God bless you. We'll see you next time.